Excellent. So my name is Brock Mowry. I'm a systems engineer for Diamanti, and I'm looking forward to showing you guys a live walkthrough demo of the Spectra 3.0 UI. All right, so video's queued up. Here we go. So we're going to log in at the top level. So this is actually a enterprise deployment from a deployment model perspective. So we are logging in effectively as the IT staff, if you will, of a company. So we're going to create a tenant here. We're going to go ahead and call this tenant T33. And then we're going to pick a color just to visually be able to track things here. We have the option to add physical capacity, virtual capacity, but for this, I'm going to add capacity later. And we're going to go ahead and create an admin account for this tenant. So summary screen, let's go ahead and submit. And then once this is completed, we're going to see the tenant show up in the list, just like the others that are there. Go ahead and click into the tenant here, just to take a quick view. And then we're going to log in as the tenant itself. So I'm going to go ahead and select that T33 account. I'm going to log in with the admin account we just created. And now we can see we're in at the tenant level. So you can see we have no infrastructure here. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a cluster. And in this instance, we are going to create an Azure cluster. So we've got to populate a little bit of Azure information here. Then we're going to do a test connection. We will get a validation that comes back. And then we're going to go ahead and save that. So now we are connected to Azure. And now we're going to provision some resources. So we're going to select a region here. I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. And then we're going to select an instance type. So these are going to be for worker nodes. In this situation, we're only going to deploy a single, but you can see we have a select box to add more. Control plane nodes, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to add an instance here. And as you can see, we were selecting a 3 value for the control plane nodes. Quick summary screen, and then let's go ahead and click Create Cluster.
Excuse me, Brock, is there anywhere where it allows you to do cost estimation in this process?
You said cost estimation?
Yeah, so if I'm deploying things out to Azure or other public clouds, is there anything that says, okay, here's this thing that I've bespoke created, how much is this going to cost me?
Sure. So today we don't have those hooks, but that is something that is of deep interest to us to be able to present back. We want to be able to show the economics of your workloads no matter where they are.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and kick back over to the video. You can see we are currently in a provisioning state. So this is over in Azure, standing up all of the required infrastructure. And we'll go from a provisioning state to a provisioned state, and then it will finalize in a running state. So I apologize, tried to speed this up a little bit and cut some time out of it, but I did want to show you the process of it creating. So we're also doing this to illustrate a infrastructure out at Azure, and then we're also in the next step going to import a local hardware cluster into this environment to be able to illustrate hybrid cloud capabilities. There we go. We can see it's now in a provisioned state, and then it should quickly jump over to a running state. Obviously, you want these things to complete so that when you do push a workload down to it, that the cluster's in place. There we go. So we jumped past where it said running, but we've now stepped into the cluster. So here you can see the details of the cluster. So we can see the node information, 2 cores, 7 gigs of RAM, for example. Okay, so here what we're going to do is we're going to add a storage class. Being that this is a new cluster, there are no storage classes defined. So we want to go ahead and define a storage class. I'm going to grab those values here real quick and populate them. And quick pro tip, don't use columns in your key value or colons. I'll clear those out here in a second. There we go. So we've successfully deployed a storage class into the Azure cluster. And now we're going to go ahead and import an existing cluster. So I have a kube config file for a cluster that's in this environment. I'm going to go ahead and grab that and pull that cluster in. And you can now see that cluster appear at the bottom. So at the top, I have an Azure resource cluster. At the bottom, I have a Diamanti hardware cluster, both under the same tenant. So here we can see we've already have some networks defined. Apologize. We're going to create some users. We need users into the project. So I'm going to go ahead and create 2 user accounts here. So T33 user 1. And projects are going to allow us to scope access into applications and resources as well. And you can also note we're doing local accounts here, but you do have the option to tie into LDAP, so an existing LDAP environment. I'm going to go ahead and create a second user here. And you can see all of the users that are related to this account. So now let's go create a project. Go ahead and call this T33P1. We're going to go ahead and add in those users that we just created. And we're going to add in the clusters that we just created as well. You have the option to reserve cluster resources. We're going to go ahead and deploy an application here. Okay, so we've deployed the application, or sorry, we've created the application. Now we need to deploy it. So you'll notice it's in a stopped state. We're going to go ahead and kick it off and assign it to a cluster. And we're going to go ahead and say deploy here. You'll notice there is the disaster recovery options there. You could toggle that and be able to set up data protection on deployment of the application. So now you can see the application is running. And in this menu, we have options to migrate the application. And had we had a second cluster, oh, we do have the second cluster. There you go. So Azure is here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and tie back to some Azure details. And this is actually going to allow us to migrate the app from the Azure, or sorry, the on-prem cluster out to the Azure cluster. So there you go. We just saw it disappear. And we can now see that it has reappeared and it's running on the Azure cluster. All right, so first step, we deployed, or we logged into the service provider domain. In this case, it's an enterprise model. Next, we created tenant 33, and we created a tenant admin account for that tenant. Then we logged in as that tenant and created the Azure cluster. Then we created we adopted a Diamanti cluster. We created a project and added the project admins to it. And then we created an application, a stateful application. And then the last step is we migrated that application from Azure to the Diamanti cluster.
Yeah. So in regards to the hybrid cloud connectivity and the options that you have there, certainly, the ability to deploy workloads into public cloud is great. And having that flexibility is something that customers are always going to want. But as soon as you deploy that workload outside of your the hardware that you're providing, you lose the benefit of the performance and everything else that's provided by that platform. So can you give an example of the type of workloads or applications that your customers are deploying today from a hybrid perspective that sees some value out of having a portion in the public cloud versus a portion on the Diamanti platform?
Yeah, the biggest driver that we're seeing around that is data locality. So it's getting data and infrastructure closer to those end users to consume, which in a lot of cases, that breadth of infrastructure already exists within those cloud providers. So that's an easy path to go ahead and adopt, be able to deploy into a region where that resource needs to be local and accessible at high speeds, for example. Yes, there are some downfalls from deploying into a public cloud in that you do have, you're dependent on the performance of that cloud's infrastructure versus the known performance of a Diamanti physical infrastructure.
So I got a question that may not be related to the demo, but it's a two-part question. One, do you specifically specialize in any industry verticals, or you just go after all the people who are trying to migrate to cloud? Because you mentioned a couple of times about enterprises. So I'm specifically trying to figure out if you focus on any vertical, whether it's finance or insurance or whatnot, right? And of course, it comes with its own set of issues. And the second one is, who's your, what's the profile of your buyer in the enterprise? Specifically, who do you go after? Who does it appeal to?
Gotcha. Jenny, do you want to take the first part?
Sure. So we have sort of two main buyers. One is the application owners, right? And this goes back to our performance advantages. Those who are responsible for that database or that AI ML workload, who are trying to get better performance out of it. The second is the operators, right? The ones who are hosting those environments. And so you saw in this demo, in 3.0 specifically, there was the domain and then the tenant admins and then project admins. Those do really represent three different kind of layers, right? The domain guy is the guy who actually racks and stacks hardware and deals with accounts. The tenant admin is usually somebody who has the ability to say, hey, this marketing team, you get these resources, this, finance team gets these resources. And then the project level is really the person who's running the specific application. So in that sense, the domain, it kind of runs through the IT operations team and application owners.
And Andy, to follow up on the vertical question, we don't have a target vertical that we're laser focused on. We do have a couple of verticals that we've had a lot of success in. So it's one of those, we are willing to have a conversation in pretty much any arena, and we want to see if we can help as many people as possible.
And with this release, though, one kind of exciting thing is that we look at the market and there's not a lot of MSP friendly solutions for Kubernetes at this point. And we do think some of the things we've created here with the tenant separation and isolation will appeal to the MSP community.